Dr. Ken Berry, Dr. Anthony Chaffee, and Dr. Ben Bikman continue to overlook the metabolic pitfalls of low-carb diets and important metabolic advantages of carbohydrates. If you've been on a low-carb diet and your thyroid has slowed down, you're struggling to get good sleep, or your energy has crashed, you're likely feeling the negative effects of low-carb diets that these doctors seem to disregard. The good news is that when you start to add in a bit of carbohydrate, your thyroid, your sleep, and your energy can rebound faster than you think. That's why in today's episode of the Mike Fave podcast, we are going to be discussing Dr. Ben Bickman's claims about carbs, fat loss, and thyroid function on low-carb diets, Dr. Ken Berry and Dr. Anthony Chaffee's interesting take on glycation and stress hormone signaling on low-carbohydrate diets, and lastly, Dr. Peat's perspective on the importance of CO2 and why carbs are essential for CO2 production and your overall metabolic health. Now, before we begin, if you're looking to start adding carbohydrates back into your low-carb diet, but you would like to do so without blood sugar crashes, weight gain, bloating, and other digestive issues, Mike created a free pro-metabolic diet calculator and food guide that you can use to get started. The link is going to be in the description below. To start the conversation, I think we should discuss the whole carbs versus fats debate and why there's such a large divide between the low-carb community, the pro-metabolic bioenergetic community that seemingly agree on so many other points, but have this fundamental disagreement on whether or not carbs or fats is the optimal fuel source. So to begin, any thoughts on that?
I think it's well, I guess first of all, it's good to be back. It's good to be
Yeah.
podcast together. But I think the low carb versus high carb camp, this debate, it's like from time immemorial, right? You have like the Kempner diet, you have the Atkins diet, then now you have keto keto carnivore versus bioenergetic. One side, eat as much carbs as you want kind of deal. On the other side, you have to absolutely limit carbs or the cause of metabolic disease. And this is despite, I think you have these key points where we all kind of agree that high amounts of processed foods are highly problematic. The idea that you want to have high levels of nutrient density, micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals. There's an agreement on that perspective. And in that animal foods, particularly between the pro-metabolic spheres and the keto carnivore spheres, they're going to be some of your best foods that provide you with quite a bit of bioavailable nutrients. And then there's the entire anti-seed oil the anti-seed oil, anti-polyunsaturated fat perspective. Now you have the other camp, which is the plant-based camps and the pro-seed oil and all this. And that's your traditional, like, standard food pyramid diet, right? A bunch of polyunsaturated fats, a bunch of grains. And both these diets, the pro-metabolic and even the sugar diet and the the keto carnivore spheres, they kind of are away from that. And that's going to be important because we're going to talk about that later. But there's a distinction there. So you have these two groups, and then the major difference between these two groups, there's some other ones, but it's around carbs versus fats. And I think the divide comes in because a lot of people who go on these low carb diets, a keto diet, a carnivore diet, they see significant improvements in metabolic markers. They see significant weight loss. And so they say, okay, like we shouldn't really have carbs. Carbs are the driving force behind all of these metabolic diseases, diabetes, obesity, fatty liver disease, etc. And then in the pro-metabolic camp, you have this perspective, which started in large part by the work of Dr. Peat, where it starts to actually look at the mechanistic differences between using carbs versus fats and starting to show like, hey, there's actually significant benefit in having carbohydrate in a diet on mitochondrial function, on hormonal function, on hydration, all of these different components, mineral balance, etc. And so there's this theoretical basis on the higher carb side, the pro-metabolic side, and then there's this experiential basis that comes from the low carb side. And the low carb side is like, look, I lost 100 pounds, therefore it works. And on the bioenergetic side, you have this other camp that sits there and says, well, based on all of these mechanisms and the research and what we understand in these different perspectives, carbs are actually the best fuel. And these people will say, well, I lost all this weight and my values are better in here. And the people over here will say, well, the research. And I think that they're seemingly like separate, but I don't think that they're actually separate. I don't think that they're paradoxical to each other. I think people are losing a bunch of weight and improving metabolic markers on the low carb keto carnivore side. I don't discount that, but I don't think that they're doing that because they are just eschewing carbs altogether. I think that when you go on a keto or carnivore diet or a low carb paleo diet, which those are the typical types of diets that are set up, you have many, many different things that change, right? You change your food quality, you change your micronutrient density, you change the types and sources of foods that you're having. Because when you eliminate carbs, you really can't have so much processed foods, some of these grain products. You start to shift your fatty acid profile, the types of fats that you're using on a regular basis. You minimize industrial food additives, and you're also increasing micronutrient density. So a whole host of things go into these dietary spheres that kind of with this change in carbohydrates, and the focus is like, oh, it's carbohydrates, but I think it's actually a variety of these other components. And then on top of that, people who are running these diets tend to run significant caloric deficits. And I think this is because it's difficult to eat enough calories on these diets, given how they're set up over time. Initially, maybe not, but over time, as you get deeper down the carnivore, keto, low carb hole, you will fall into a circumstance where you are at one meal a day, right? And you're doing intermittent fasting. I was in this camp as well. I was doing 2 meals a day, and I was doing a 16-8 window on the fast, and I was a keto, less than 50 grams of carbs. And it was an effort to eat enough. And so you lose a bunch of weight. And while you lose a bunch of weight, especially body fat, because protein's kept high, you see change in metabolic markers. And so it's like, okay, so we see these benefits, we can see these changes. But then what happens, you have in the pro-metabolic camp, a large people in this pro-metabolic camp came from these low-carb camps, because you develop problems inside the low-carb camp. So we're going to talk about here with thyroid function, electrolyte balance, antioxidant status, microbiome and digestive issues over the long term, and then also issues with stress hormones. So we see these changes here, and then people are like, okay, so what's the next step? And then you get to the point where it's like, oh, it's not carbs. Maybe it's not carbs. So it's like, which types of carbs do I incorporate into the diet? So I think this divide is created, a paradox is created between the two spheres because of a lack of understanding of what's actually creating the benefit in the low carb camp and in the keto and carnivore camp. And in the bioenergetic camp, there's an understanding of like the mechanisms, but then how they're applied in that sphere is also interesting, because you have a bunch of people coming out of low carb and just throwing ad libitum, very rapidly digesting carb sources in the diet to help manage stress. So it's creating the weird divide, but it's not necessarily because of carbs versus no carbs. And we could talk about what obviously my stance is on carbs.
Yeah. And I think, you mentioned the sugar diet, and I think that's why the conversation is really relevant now, because we are seeing a lot of people, some prominent influencers that were low carb or carnivore, that are, if not fully now like into eating carbohydrates, or at least flirting with the idea and adding some in little by little and sort of making the start of the transition. And a lot of those influencers are catching flack from the community. And there's even guys like Ken Berry and Dr. Anthony Chaffee, who are sort of like almost standing up for the carnivore like perspective now. Like they feel like they've been called to sort of defend the position. And so they're taking on some of the arguments and some of the experiences that people have had as they move into eating more carbohydrates. They're trying to take those head on. And some of the clips that we have today will you'll be reacting, we'll be watching the the rationale or the justification for why some people may be experiencing benefits from having carbohydrates in the diet. So we'll get into those clips. But the first clip that we want to start off with is actually from Dr. Ben Bikman. And in this clip, he's going to talk about how you can either be a fat burner or a sugar burner, and that maybe if you're a sugar burner, that could be detrimental if you're trying to lose weight. So let's jump into that clip, and then we'll get your thoughts after.
As a metabolic scientist, I'm interested in how the body uses energy. And metabolically speaking, the body's kind of like a hybrid. It has two fuels, and these two fuels are fats and glucose, or blood sugar. And at any moment, the body is burning a mix of these fuels. It's shifting between them to varying degrees. Sometimes we're fat burning, other times we're sugar burning. What dictates which fuel we're using is the hormone insulin. When insulin is elevated, the body is in sugar burning mode. When insulin is down, the body's in fat burning mode. In fact, sometimes insulin's down for so long that the body's burning so much fat that it starts turning some of that fat into ketones. And that's why a low insulin diet is referred to as a ketogenic diet. But the question really is, which fuel are you burning? Are you a fat burner or are you a sugar burner? And insulin is what's going to dictate that. But if you're trying to lose weight, good luck losing weight if you're a sugar burner.
Okay. So at the end of that clip, he seems to imply that if you are burning sugar for fuel, then it will be difficult to lose weight. And that's because if you eat carbohydrates, then you're going to raise insulin. And with high insulin, that's going to somewhat make it challenging, I guess, to lose weight, according to Dr. Ben Bikman.
Yeah, so it's an interesting take because it's pretty clear from the research at this point that whether you're on a high-fat diet or you're on a high-carb diet or a lower-fat, high-carb diet, you basically will lose weight. Like it's total energy intake is going to be the most important thing. And there is a meta-analysis here. This is from 2022. It's the effects of low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets versus low-carbohydrate, high-fat diets on weight, blood pressure, serum lipids, and blood glucose, a systematic review and meta-analysis. This is from the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And basically what they say this was in the conclusionary statement. They say between the two groups, changes in lean mass, fat mass, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, triglycerides, and glucose were non-significant. So there was really no difference between those factors on a low carb versus a high carb diet. They said to conclude, both diets are effective for weight control and reduction of cardiovascular risk factors. Now, to be fair, in this conclusion statement, they do say that compared with low-fat, high-carb diets, low-carb, high-fat diets had a greater effect on weight loss, about 1 kilogram. But since we're not really seeing a change in fat mass, and we're also not seeing a change in lean mass, then I would guess that a large portion of this weight change, which is really about 2 pounds, is not that much, is a function of water weight. Because when you do go on a low-carbohydrate diet, and we'll talk about this, there's changes in water status and hydration status due to changes in some of the insulin signaling and then changes into glycogen content and stuff like this. So this is going to, yes, that's where you see that rapid weight loss in the initial couple of weeks. When you start keto or carnivore, because you don't have the carbohydrates, you start seeing this change in loss in water. And you feel like, wow, I lost so much weight so fast. But what we're really looking to lose when we're losing weight is fat tissue. It's not really about water tissue so much. We don't really want to lose bone mass. We don't really want to lose lean mass. We really want to lose fat tissue specifically. So when you're embarking on any type of weight loss diet, whether low carb or high carb, the most important thing is that body fat is what's coming off. The body fat coming off is what's going to change the metabolic markers significantly in terms of insulin sensitivity, blood glucose, and components like this. Lipids are going to be adjusted based on the fuel source, but overall, the primary metabolic markers, the really important ones that are going to shift, are going to be related to loss of body fat. And so this idea that if you have carbs in your diet, that you're not going to lose weight, I don't think that's true. I don't think the research supports that. I think that's a theoretical understanding from Dr. Bickman around the idea that insulin basically lowers the release of free fatty acids from your fat stores. Go ahead, you.
So on the insulin topic, what do you say to people who will tell you they don't want to eat carbohydrate because they don't want to spike insulin, and then that will make it harder for them to lose fat, or that will make them put on fat?
So essentially, the first thing is that acute spikes of insulin after a meal don't necessarily dictate whether you lose fat or not. It's total energy intake across the day. Now, the ability to take food and convert it to energy, there's multiple steps there that are important. So that's why it's not just calories in, calories out. Like, this stuff has to be fixed in order for us to truly understand what's going on between food in and energy out, right? Because you have to convert that food into energy. But when you see people who are having a hard time losing weight, or they have like metabolic dysfunction and insulin levels are high, the insulin levels are high because of insulin resistance at the cells and at the tissues. So the liver, the fat tissue, the muscle tissue is not able to respond to insulin effectively. It can't internalize insulin and degrade it, so you get a higher circulating level of insulin. So you're actually insulin resistant, which is leading to the high levels of insulin. That's not necessarily because of carbohydrate intake. Because if anything, if metabolism is functioning well, body composition is going well, and this doesn't mean that you can't have carbs if you're in a metabolically impaired state. You see that in the comments all the time. But if those things are going well, you don't need that much insulin to actually utilize the carbohydrate or push the carbohydrate into the fat tissue, the muscle tissue, and the liver. So you don't actually raise insulin levels. Like, for example, my carbohydrate intake, and I'll show a client example. I'm at 400 to 450 grams of sugar a day currently. My fasting insulin was 4 recently. I just tested it. And it's like, so it's because I don't need that much insulin to process the amount of carbohydrate that I have on a regular basis. And also my A1C is low. And also my fasting glucose is low because my blood glucose levels are being maintained appropriately because my cells and tissues are able to uptake the carbohydrate. So this is the really important piece. And that doesn't dictate my body composition where I'm gaining fat because of this. Because when I have the meal, I have the carbohydrates, insulin rises, the cells respond, insulin comes back down. They don't have this high circulating insulin all the time due to metabolic dysfunction. That's impairing what's going on in terms of the conversion of food into energy. And that's specifically in the mitochondria and at the cellular level where that problem is arising.
And it's central to the theory of that you want to be oxidizing carbohydrates over fats because it's going to create that more efficient metabolism, right? That's like sort of the bioenergetic theory as opposed to the fat, and therefore you'll be you'll be producing energy more efficiently that way. And improving insulin sensitivity, right? The carbohydrates will help improve the insulin sensitivity.
Yeah, so using fats as a primary fuel source makes you insulin resistant. It makes you less able to oxidize carbohydrates well. Now, it is physiologic insulin resistance for some people, but overall, you become less insulin sensitive the more fats that you oxidize. And this is because fatty acid oxidation impairs glucose oxidation. That is through the Randle cycle. And the more fats you shift into the diet with the lower carbs that you have, the more you're going to oxidize fats and the less well you're going to be able to oxidize carbohydrates. And again, it's a spectrum. It's not a switch and a black.
Right.
There's a change. Now, the reason so then it's like, okay, well, why on this low carb diet am I seeing improvements in insulin and glucose and hemoglobin A1C? And it's like, because you don't have carbohydrates coming in. So you haven't fundamentally fixed this problem of taking carbs and converting it into energy inside the cell and at the mitochondria. You've just moved into a circumstance where you're not exposed to carbohydrate. And therefore, your blood glucose levels aren't rising. You're not going to see more glucose or like the bumps in glucose that can impact your A1C values. And if you're running higher A1C values in general, because you had higher blood glucose values overall, when you don't have carbs, it'll bring those down. But you still haven't fixed this fundamental problem. You just removed the agent, you removed glucose out of there. And also you can still find those people, they can still have higher fasting insulin levels than are ideal. And that could be determined by body composition. You have a higher body fat percentage, even if you go on a low carb diet, you can still see higher insulin levels than are ideal because you have issues with insulin sensitivity in response to that insulin. Because when the insulin reaches the cell, it gets taken inside the cell and then it gets degraded. It gets cleared out of circulation. But when the cells can't respond, that process gets impeded and it's not able to happen anymore. So you see this high circulating insulin levels from lack of clearance. So this is really important. The other thing that's important to put in here, you talk about efficiency. The reason why, because people will then say, okay, well, then why do I even need carbs in the first place, right? Because I could just not have carbs, and then I'll keep insulin low, and I'll keep A1C low, and I'll keep my glucose levels low. And so A, you have stress hormones, so we'll get into that. But then B, you have the other problem of oxidizing fatty acids is inherently worse than oxidizing glucose. And the reason why is because when you burn fatty acids, you change NAD plus to NADH ratio. So shifting towards higher NADH is a marker of reductive stress and is directly associated with a variety of disease processes, including diabetes. So fats push you towards having a higher NADH level in the mitochondria. This ratio is super important. It indicates what's going on in the mitochondria. On top of that, you get an increased production of reactive oxygen species in the mitochondria. So you get more smoke, basically. And then you also have an impedance of antioxidant function in the mitochondria because you need the glucose to run through the pentose phosphate pathway to produce NADPH and recycled glutathione, which is the master antioxidant of the cell. So you have this circumstance, you have more ROS and you have less antioxidant function. And on top of that, fats drive uncoupling through this ROS production and through this change in the membrane potential in the mitochondria because of what's going on between NADH and NAD+. And then an FADH and NADH ratios. And then now you get uncoupling, which means you get less ATP per unit per oxidation of fat because the the electron transport chain and the Krebs cycle are not fully linked anymore. You have a release of heat through the and a release of protons through the mitochondrial membrane that basically stops this conversion or taking of the FADH2 and the NADH and converting into ATP through complex 4. So you have burning fats fundamentally creates a slowdown across the board in the mitochondria, drives more ROS, and backs the whole system up. So that's why in the pro-metabolic perspective, from a mechanistic standpoint, oxidizing carbohydrates is the ideal fuel source. And then fatty acids are the backup fuel source that you run on when you don't have adequate carbohydrates, or when you're under stress, or when you're starving, or when you have metabolic dysfunction, or when you have an infection or something like this. You shift towards fatty acid oxidation in those circumstances. So it's kind of more of a sign of metabolic dysfunction to move in those states versus oxidizing carbs. And that's because the way carbs are oxidized inside the mitochondria, and then what happens when things are working well, it's much more optimal from a biochemical standpoint than using fatty acids.
Got it. And you have clients that you've worked with too, who are coming from low carbohydrate diets, who are struggling with weight loss, that moved into a pro-metabolic perspective or bioenergetic perspective, added in carbohydrates, and saw improvements in muscle mass and loss of fat after making that switch, right?
Yeah, so I pulled an example here to show us. So I have a client, this is a woman in her 40s. So when we started working together, it was around April, May 2025. And so we had started with a DEXA scan to see what's going on with her body composition. And we have some starting stats here. So when we started, glucose 91 milligrams per deciliter, hemoglobin A1C 5.5%, insulin is 7. And then her liver function values, AST 16, ALT 11. I pulled these because these are some of the best markers we have for insulin sensitivity. And then also people in the low carb community basically say that if you have carbohydrates, you're going to cause fatty liver. So I pulled markers so that we can compare pre and post, and then I have the DEXA scan results. Obviously, I'm not sharing any of her personal information. But basically, when we started, she weighed about 144 pounds. Her fat mass was around 50 pounds. Her lean mass was around 89.7 pounds. And then I have her visceral adipose tissue here was 1.15 pounds when we started. And then I have her bone mineral content here, which was 4.5 pounds, right? So this is where we started at. And our goal was like, hey, let's actually, we need you to lose body fat. That's the most important thing. The body fat percentage when we started was 34.7%. I wanted her between 20 to 30%, ideally around 25% body fat. That's where 20 to 25% is where you start to see, I guess, optimal body fat percentage for women, depending on the context, right? Some women are going to hold a little bit more versus others. But in general, that's the rough range that I'm typically shooting for. So we're looking to get her around 25%. So what we did was, and I'm going to share her macros and her caloric intake here. So basically, we ran a 20% deficit for 5 months. We had her at 1620 calories, 120 grams of protein, 150 grams of carbs, and 60 grams of fat. After the 5 months, so in September, we redrew her labs. Her glucose is 88 milligrams per deciliter, so she's less than 90 now. Her insulin went to 4 from 7, so we wanted less than 5. Her A1C went to 5% from 5.5%. Her CRP is now 0.3 milligrams per deciliter, just to show that she's not inflamed from having carbohydrates, because that's something that people say. Her ESR was 2 millimeters per hour. Ideal would be less than 10 for a woman. I like to see it less than 5. So again, CRP, ESR being inflammatory markers, neither are elevated. And her ALT and AST values are normal. They're still less than 25, which would be ideal. So AST 19 units per liter and ALT 17 units per liter. But what the question is, like, what actually happened to her body composition? So her body fat percentage went from 34.7% to 29.3%. Her total body mass, she's here 131.7. That is down from 144.2. So that's roughly, what is that? So 132 from 140, 144. So 12 pounds of total weight loss. Her fat mass dropped from 50 to 39. So 11 pounds of that was actually body fat. And then her lean mass dropped from 89.7 to 88.6. So 1 pound of lean mass loss. And her bone mineral content, her bone mass stayed the same, 4.5 pounds. So she lost 11 pounds of body fat, only 1 pound of lean mass, and her bone mass stayed exactly the same. And her body fat percentage went from about 35 to about 29. So she lost 6% body fat, and then her visceral fat got cut in half. So we were 1.15 pounds before, and now we're 0.5 pounds. So basically, while we ran this diet, she had adequate, ample amount of carbs, 150 grams of carbs per day, which is definitely not keto, definitely not low carb, way higher than is recommended in a carnivore or keto sphere. She wasn't really hungry while we set this up, and she didn't really lose any appreciable amount of muscle tissue. She just lost body fat. It was just a progressive process of her losing a pound per week, just taking a pound off per week over time to hit her particular goal. And then now once she hits her specific target, so once we get her at about 25% body fat, we'll just bring her back up to normal intake and then go from there. And we started doing some weight training along this way so we can start to increase her lean muscle tissue over time. So overall, this is I know it's N equals 1. That's completely fair. But at the same time, this is a woman in her 40s who lost only body fat, right? 1 pound of lean muscle tissue, 11 pounds of body fat over a period of a few months. And this is with DEXA scans. And she cut her visceral adipose tissue in half by 50%. She lost the fat around her organs. So the research is showing this, right? You can see this in meta-analysis that whether it's low carb, high fat, or high carb, low fat, you can lose weight. This wasn't even necessarily high carb, low fat. Total energy intake is what's going to dictate this, but we don't want to go low carb for the variety of reasons I talked about before, and we'll talk about them throughout the rest of this podcast. And all of her insulin sensitivity markers improved. And then on top of that, she kept her lean muscle tissue, she lost the fat around her organs, and she kept her bone mass and her, etc. So this is what we're looking for. This is what I'm looking for as a practitioner. This is what I want to see. I do not want to see lean muscle tissue loss like what you see with GLP-1 drugs or intensive fasting regimens, because then there's issues with hormonal function over the long term from starving yourself, which we'll get into. And on top of that, you see a heavy loss of lean muscle tissue where you wind up in a circumstance where you, on the back end, your metabolic rate is lower. And now you have to eat less to maintain your body weight the same. On top of it's very difficult to actually maintain and build lean mass as you get older. It's much more difficult. So the goal is actually preservation of bone mass, of muscle tissue over the long term, if not building it, not necessarily going on really crazy diets to lose it. So I think that's super important. And on top, the other thing that I think is super important is that her hormonal function over this time frame has gotten better because we kept carbohydrates on board. We didn't see an increase in reverse T3. We didn't see bumping up of cortisol levels and stuff like this. So her hormonal function looks good. Her insulin and insulin sensitivity is better. Her body composition is better. And because she didn't really lose much lean tissue, when we get her back to her maintenance intake, she's just going to go back to the same intake even before she lost the weight where she was at maintenance. So just something to keep in mind. And that she came from a lower carbohydrate diet. Her and her husband were trying out like a carnivore-ish setup for a period of time, and they look to transition out into pro-metabolic afterwards.
Gotcha. And the hormone discussion is a good transition into the next clip. That is also from Dr. Ben Bikman, and he's discussing how on low carbohydrate diets you get downregulation of thyroid hormone. So let's pull up the next clip, and then we'll get your thoughts afterwards.
One of the common misconceptions with regards to a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet is that it's going to damage the thyroid gland. I hear this kind of comment very often. There is no evidence to support that. That conclusion that the thyroid gland is somehow damaged is based on the fact that in some clinical studies, overall thyroid hormone goes down in the blood. But why should that represent a problem? Let's take, for example, insulin. We know that when someone is insulin resistant, their insulin levels are elevated. And when they adopt a low carbohydrate diet, insulin levels come down. This doesn't mean that the pancreas is somehow suffering. It just means that the body has become more sensitive to the insulin. The same applies to thyroid hormone. The fact that thyroid hormone levels may drop somewhat on a low carbohydrate diet doesn't indicate that the thyroid gland is somehow damaged, but just that the thyroid hormone itself is working better, and so the thyroid gland starts to produce less.
Oh, man.
So I guess he's drawing a parallel, right, between the pancreas and insulin and TSH values and thyroid hormone.
I just don't think so. The first argument's a straw man, because it's not that the thyroid gland is getting damaged when you go on a low carb diet. That's not the argument, and that never was the argument.
Right.
The argument was that active thyroid hormone in the form of T3 decreases, and you get a bump in reverse T3, and in the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which produces TRH and TSH, actually don't upregulate to try to increase thyroid in this state. So it's like that's like that wasn't the argument that the thyroid gland gets damaged. So that's sure, I agree with you. There's no evidence that the thyroid gets damaged when you go on a low carb diet, but there is clear and obvious evidence that T3 levels go down and reverse T3 levels go up, and that TSH and TRH don't compensate for the lack of T3. So we'll talk about that. The next point that he gets into, though, he says, well, it's just like on a low carb diet, you know, the insulin values come down, and that's because insulin sensitivity is better, which is false. That is not true. That is not necessarily true. On a low carbohydrate diet, insulin levels come down because you don't eat carbohydrates.
Right.
And then as you lose weight, then insulin sensitivity can improve, but it's not necessarily because you are not having carbohydrates. Not having carbohydrates actually impairs insulin sensitivity over the long term because you force fatty acid oxidation, which impairs glucose utilization at the cells. So, and this is why when you have carnivores and keto people go do an oral glucose tolerance test, their insulin sensitivity is worse.
Well, when they, like, if I jump in, I've watched some Ben Bikman, and I know what he would say, like, to that is that, he would like to define it as you're like, transiently glucose intolerant and not necessarily insulin resistant, you know? So
I don't know that, like, it's the same. Okay, so physiologic insulin resistance versus like being pathologic insulin resistant.
Right. Well, I think he would say that if you were to go do an oral glucose tolerance test, but 8 hours before your oral glucose tolerance test, you ate some carbohydrate, the pancreas would make more preformed insulin. And then when you go and do your oral glucose tolerance test, you would score way better. And I guess his distinction is like, if you didn't do that and you're on a low carb diet, and then you go and you fail horribly at the oral glucose tolerance test, you're going to walk away thinking you're insulin resistant. When in his mind, that doesn't mean that you're insulin resistant. It just means that you were in this, transient, phase and whatever, right?
There's a couple things that to keep in mind with this is that if you took a diabetic and you put them on a low carbohydrate diet and then they didn't lose any weight, but their A1C and their other markers got better, they stayed the same, like they were the type 2 diabetic, they're obese, whatever the deal is, nothing changed in that front, but they went on a low carb diet and then they brought carbs back in after, they would still be insulin resistant. Most likely. It's not going to fix it. You're going to see an improvement of markers, hemoglobin A1C, potentially insulin, and then potentially glucose values when you're on a low carb diet because you are not exposed to carbohydrates.
Right.
But when you bring carbohydrates back on board, if weight hasn't been lost or liver fat hasn't been cleared through the intervention, then you're going to be in the same spot. So the thing is like the initial improvements that you see on low carbohydrate is not because you are improving insulin sensitivity. It's because you don't have carbohydrate. That is why the values actually improve. So the analogy is incorrect. The analogy is like it's not a comparable analogy that, oh, insulin is just working better when you don't have carbs. It's like you aren't even getting to determine if insulin's working better because you don't have carbs. So that's like the analogy doesn't even make sense with it. I wouldn't even draw a parallel between the two, on top of the fact that they're completely different hormonal systems, and that's not necessarily how these things work, nor like that's a theory that he's posited, but I haven't seen evidence to suggest that thyroid hormone is just working better. I think that's a cope because a lot of people who come out of a low carbohydrate diet typically have symptoms of hypothyroidism. They have high reverse T3 values and they have low T3 values. And a lot of times they're dealing with cold hands, cold feet, cold intolerance, etc. Now, is that, no, I'm not saying it's everybody, but that is something that this is well known. And so it's not damaging the thyroid. The insulin system works differently than the thyroid system. So the analogy doesn't even compare. The analogy is incorrect fundamentally because going on a low carb diet doesn't just automatically fix insulin sensitivity. It changes values because you're not exposed to carbohydrates. And then on top of that, like there's an actual worsening of thyroid function on lower carbohydrate diets that you can't ignore. So I could show the graphics here, but this is not ideal for thyroid function. This is well known. So I don't to come out and be like, well, I think it's because thyroid's working better. It's like, you can have whatever theories you want, but like, let's actually see some degree of proof that this is actually the case, instead of like, here's some analogy to another hormonal system that I study that is separate, and then the analogy is incorrect.
Yeah, and it's also what you said in the beginning was so true about how he frames it as damaging the thyroid gland. Like, I'm not sure that's necessarily the argument that people have, right? It's more like, I've been on a low carbohydrate diet for a while. I have hypothyroid symptoms and my thyroid labs don't look good. That's more, where people are coming from. And then you can see those people add carbohydrates back in, lose the hypothyroid symptoms, and their thyroid labs look good. Does that mean that when the thyroid labs were bad on low carb, that thyroid was just more efficient? Like, would that still be the argument? I don't know, but it would be cool to have Dr. Ben Bickman, like, to have a discussion about that, because I think you guys are both, very into the research and everything. And admittedly, in his sort of longer form theory of thyroid hormone downregulation on low carbohydrate diets, he does acknowledge the fact that this is a bit of a hypothesis that he's making, that there's a thyroid sensitivity, not that thyroid sensitivity doesn't exist, but that's what's happening under the low carbohydrate state.
I just want to add a couple things here.
Okay.
So just what actually happens is peripheral conversion changes. So when you have your, I have a graphic here. So let's just go through the graphic really quick, because I think it'll help people understand a little bit better. Okay. So with thyroid, your hypothalamus produces TRH. This is thyrotropin releasing hormone that goes to the pituitary gland and tells the pituitary gland to release TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, thyroid stimulating hormone's job is to tell the thyroid gland to make T3 and T4, the thyroid hormones, right? Now, the human thyroid gland produces mainly T4, which is why you see this as 80%, and not so much T3, which is why you see this as 20%. The reason why it does this, to some extent, or at least this is part of the theory around thyroid hormone regulation, is that when the T4 is released, the other tissues, like the liver, the brain, the kidney, skeletal muscle, etc., they express enzymes. The liver is actually a major site for this. They're called a deiodinase enzyme. So you have deiodinase 1, 2, and 3. All right. So on a ketogenic diet, because you don't have insulin signaling, because you have a decrease in leptin signaling, you have an increase in glucocorticoid signaling, you have an increase in glucagon signaling, right? They say glucagon dominant state. What winds up happening is the deiodinase enzymes type 1 and type 2 get down regulated. So the conversion of T4 to T3 decreases. Now, T4 doesn't really have much active effect. It's technically storage thyroid hormone, or pro-hormone for T3, right? The major hormone that has the effect is T3. The other hormones, not as significant an effect as T3. T3 is the primary hormone with the effect. So what winds up happening is you have less conversion to active T3, and then you upregulate another enzyme called deiodinase type 3, which takes the T4 and converts it into reverse T3. Now, reverse T3 competes with T3 at the cell sites. This is part of the hypothesis for its action. So you actually have a drainage of T4 down the reverse T3 pathway, which is at least at the minimum not active hormone, and at the maximum directly antagonistic to T3. And then you have a lack of T3 hormone. So you move into a low thyroid state. And the thing is, like, why would this be the case? It's like, oh, my body is just way more sensitive to thyroid at this point. It's like, no, you're starving. You're in a starvation mimicking state. Are we going to try to increase mitochondrial biogenesis, and we're going to try to increase flux through the mitochondria in a state where we don't have adequate amounts of carbohydrate coming in, an adequate amount of fuel, and we are running on fatty acids, and we're uncoupling the mitochondria, we're producing less ATP in terms of the fatty acid being produced, and then like slipping between the electron transport chain and the Krebs cycle through uncoupling. It's like, no, this is an adaptation to not have, to like basically being in a starvation mimicking state with ketosis and running primarily on fatty acids. It's not because you're just more sensitive to thyroid hormone. At least that would be my perspective on this. And that kind of lines up, because then what winds up happening as well is in this state, the hypothalamus doesn't, and so production of TRH and the pituitary gland's production of TSH, they don't upregulate to try to even correct this. It's like, okay, we're starving. Like we don't actually have the, like this anabolic signal coming in from insulin. We're running primarily on glucagon. we're breaking down our own tissues, our own fat stores, and our own muscle tissue to provide substrate. So it's like, why would you increase your fuel utilization in a state where you are breaking your stores down? That's like if we're all starving and we're huddled together at a campsite. It's like, let's eat as much of our food as possible. Like, let's increase our consumption of our food stores as we only have a limited supply. So it's a weird dynamic to say, oh yeah, we're just more sensitive to our thyroid hormone, when it's like your body is directly shifting away from active thyroid hormone production towards pro-hormone and anti-thyroid hormone production, in quotations there, anti-thyroid hormone production with reverse T3. And that's also why some people, not all people, but some people experience a worsening of thyroid symptoms when they go on low carbohydrate diets. It's through this pathway, and it's not that sensitivity improves to these things, because upregulation of some of the other hormone systems have direct negative impacts on thyroid as well. So this is an adaptation to not having carbohydrates.
Right.
But it's calling this it's not, I guess you wouldn't say but this is not an optimal adaptation you want to make. This is an adaptation to this state, not necessarily an improvement of thyroid hormone function.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like just overview what you were saying about, like, I guess low carbohydrate is this sort of starvation state, and then when you have carbohydrate and you do see like insulin go up after eating and stuff like that, that's indicative of a fed state. And there's certain processes that only happen under a fed state and certain processes that only happen under a starvation state, right? And like when you're in a starvation state, you see the downregulations of the hormones, and there's even stuff that you've talked about, right, with like SHBG goes up. But then when you see insulin go up in a fed state, it's like SHBG goes down, and you have more of the sex steroids, and it's more of this, like, it is like the body is in abundance, right? And it's willing to turn on certain functions because of the fact that it's it feels like well nourished, right? Versus this other pseudo starvation state.
Exactly. And that's the overarching hypothesis. Like, if you have adequate fuel sources coming in the form of carbohydrates, which again, like the idea from the pro-metabolic perspective, from my perspective, right? This is my understanding of this from Dr. Peat's work, being in the pro-metabolic sphere, reading the papers, that carbohydrate oxidation is an ideal state to shoot for,
Sure.
like having effective carbohydrate oxidation for a variety of pathways that I discussed. And when the body is not in that state and is forced to adjust towards fatty acids as the primary fuel state, it is considered a starvation mimicking state, because you're primarily burning fatty acids. And then there's a whole host of metabolic adaptations that go with that to help you deal with that stress, to help you deal with this state. But it's like, that's not optimal when you start looking at the differences between them. And then B, to like start to try to rationalize these adaptations as these are good things, just because people lose weight or they see changes in A1C or insulin values on these diets, when you can still do that with carbohydrates, I think I don't think is fully correct. I personally disagree with that.
Mm-hmm. So moving on the topic of insulin and keto and everything, one of the things people experience when they go on the keto diet, especially in the beginning, is this thing called the keto flu. And the common recommendation to deal with that is like to do a bunch of electrolytes, take a bunch of electrolytes, increase your salt intake and everything. So that kind of leads into the role of insulin in hydration. So we'll talk about that. But before we get into it, so we have a clip from Nick Norwitz, and we also have a clip from Ken Berry describing this keto flu phenomenon. So we'll pull up those clips, play those, and then get your thoughts after.
Some people develop fatigue and headaches when they start a ketogenic diet. To be clear, this keto flu isn't actually a flu. It's kind of just your body throwing a tantrum because you took away its sugar. Kind of like a toddler who just heard no at the toy store. Throwing a tantrum. Anyway, the most common reason for this keto flu is a temporary imbalance in electrolytes as your body adjusts. Therefore, do not be afraid to salt your food liberally. Many people use a Himalayan pink salt or Redmond's real salt. You can also mix in some low salt, which is really rich in potassium, if that's a concern. It's generally recommended to get 3.5 grams or more of potassium daily, which you can get from foods like salmon, zucchini, and avocado, all very keto-friendly, and also you can supplement with low salt. That's what I do on occasion, and actually I kind of like the taste, although it is an acquired taste.
keto flu, what that actually is, just ask ChatGPT, what are the symptoms of keto flu and what are the symptoms of withdrawal from alcohol or tobacco? It's literally line by line, the same exact thing. So the keto flu that everybody was scared to death of, that's really just sugar withdrawal symptoms.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Both of them frame the sugar thing as like you're an addict or you're just a whiny toddler, right? Because you got your candy taken away. You know, you're only a real adult if you eat steak and an avocado. But yeah, so
I mean, I think that Nick's response overall was a bit more balanced. I mean, I think it's a little patronizing, like the whiny baby thing, and then like the addiction stuff. Like it's like, how many times are we going to hear you're just a carb addict or whatever the deal is? But I think Nick's point is actually true, that a portion of the keto flu is related to a lack of insulin signaling that shifts the electrolyte balance with sodium and potassium. I also think it's in the initial couple of weeks, like as your body is shifting from running on carbohydrates, as you deplete your glycogen stores and you start to upregulate glucagon signaling and breakdown of protein tissues in the body and breakdown of fats, you start to drive a stress response within the first 3 weeks. This is known, like this is not debatable. This is very well known that you get a stress response in the first 3 weeks as you shift into ketosis. I think there's the stress response plus the electrolyte imbalance go together. And basically what happens, which I guess the big thing here is that you could just not have this by just having carbs. Like you don't have to create this electrolyte imbalance and feel terrible because you're not having carbs.
Well,
so
yeah,
go ahead.
Just sorry to cut you off, but just what I thought was funny, and I know it's a short on like what to do under a keto, like you're trying to be keto, so he recommends like avocado, salmon, whatever. They're all keto foods because they have potassium. So I was like, you know what else has potassium? Maybe it's not keto, but like fruits have potassium, you know, like a lot of carbohydrates, potatoes have potassium. So it's just a weird, yeah, it's weird.
Well, the problem with this is that, and this is what people long deep into keto still have these problems. This is not just like a first couple weeks thing. This is a perpetual thing where like clients that I've worked with coming out of keto have had like severe muscle cramps and electrolyte imbalance stuff. Like they can't get hydrated. They have to dose all this salt and stuff for like the whole time that they're in it. And that's because the insulin signaling at the kidney helps you to actually retain the sodium at the kidney. So the insulin signals transporters in the kidney itself that allow you to reabsorb sodium. And then for potassium, it's kind of low in the diet, depending on how you set it up. You can still reach your potassium intake on a keto diet. It just depends on what you do. If it's steaks and butter, probably not going to cut it. But if there's more variety in like kind of the diet that at least part of the things that Nick discusses will allow you to hit a higher potassium intake. For example, I like to shoot for 5 grams a day. But that can be kind of hard in the keto diet unless you set it up appropriately, but it is possible. But the insulin actually helps to push the potassium in the cell. And these are important because potassium hydrates the interior portion of the cell, and then sodium hydrates the intravascular portion, the bloodstream. And so when you're on keto, you're always feeling dehydrated. I had this myself. I could not get hydrated because you don't have that insulin signaling. And without the insulin signaling, you wind up in a circumstance where you're not retaining the sodium at your kidney and you're not pushing potassium into the cell. And then on top of that, if thyroid function does go on the keto diet, you can fall into a circumstance where you have a harder time maintaining magnesium status in the cell as well, because the thyroid is helpful for stimulating ATP production, and ATP and magnesium are bonded together, and that's what kind of holds the magnesium inside the cell. So this low carb state and a shift in thyroid function can directly affect electrolyte balance across the board. On top of, in the first couple of weeks, you drive a very strong stress response as you switch into this kind of adaptive state where you don't have the carbohydrates present, which is, I think, largely responsive for the keto flu. So I think Nick's points were actually just helpful. The whiny baby thing, I maybe a little
yeah.
The Ken Berry stuff, I don't even know what this guy's talking about, to be honest. Like, don't quote ChatGPT. Don't come to me with a like, well, ChatGPT says this and this. Like, that is not a source. That's not a reference. And also, even if you have similar symptoms between two different things, it doesn't mean that the underlying causes are exactly the same. So it's not like, I don't know, like, it's just not a good look to come and quote ChatGPT. And also this idea that people are carb addicts, like that somebody's craving carbs and that it's an addiction. again, we see this in the comments all the time. Like, I don't think that it's an addiction. And I think calling people carb addicts and implying that they're weak of will if they want to have carbohydrates in their diet, and creating this whole shame dynamic around, oh, if you have carbohydrates, you're not one of us, you're just an addict. It's just a weird dynamic, and it doesn't actually play out physiologically. It's the same thing like, oh, this portion in the brain and your nucleus accumbens, like it gets lit up when you have carbohydrates and when you have fat and when you have like steak and stuff like this. Like, are we addicted to all of these things? Like, no, there's certain fuel sources that we are going to be seeking out to have on a regular basis to supply our bodies. We are going to seek out, this is why we have taste for certain things, right? We're going to seek out sodium. We're going to seek out carbohydrate. We're going to seek out protein. We're going to seek out fats as well, because these are the things that our body needs to run effectively on a consistent basis. We also have a drive for thirst. It's the same thing. We need to have adequate water status. So it's really important to differentiate between what's an addiction and what's actually a core drive that we are searching for, that our body is telling us we need, not just to survive, but to optimize our health overall. Because you can survive this whole, like, you can survive without carbs. Yes, you can. Sure. But it's like, is that the same as reaching an optimal health state? And for a variety of reasons, no. We could talk about those reasons, but no. And you can see here, like, when you don't have carbs, there's all these bending over backwards things you have to justify. Oh, you need to add more salt. Oh, you need to add more potassium. Oh, well, your thyroid function is not going to look as good, but this is just an adaptation. Oh, the cortisol response is just for 3 weeks.
Or your hemoglobin, your red blood cells have a longer lifespan. There's all these, yeah.
Yeah, we just need to redefine the entire paradigm across the board for all the lab values and all of these things to justify why this diet is the best, when it's like it's a weird dynamic, because if something falls and the insulin values are optimal when you're on a low carb diet, but thyroid, well, that doesn't actually apply. It's like this, like, pick and choose the thing and then redefine it for your own purposes to justify why something that you're doing has a problem. And I think this is part of the problem in the sphere. Like, if people came out and said, and we'll see this with the Ken Berry and Anthony Chaffee clip, but if they just came out and said, hey, like, here's some potential things you could run on low carb. Here's some of the problems that you can run on, and this is why it happens, instead of gaslighting people and being like, well, no, you're not hypothyroid. The reference ranges are just BS. Like, your T3, like, being low, it's just because you're more sensitive to T3. That's why, even though your hands and feet are cold and you're constipated and you're losing your hair. It's like, this type of stuff is not helpful for people. If our fundamental goal is to get people better, to figure out how we can get them into a healthier state, then gaslighting to prove our point is not helpful.
Yeah.
It's anti-helpful.
Yeah. And I think my suspicion is that there's people who are a little bit fed up with the idea that, like, they're not carnivoring hard enough, or they're not low carbing hard enough, and they're kind of being ridiculed a little bit if they have, like, a symptom. It must be because they somehow strayed away from the strict regimented, diet that they should be following. And then people are, like, even worse. They go and they experiment a little bit with carbohydrates and they get some benefit and they talk about it. And it's like they get trashed in their comment section, And so it's a little bit toxic, I think. And there's people who are becoming more open to the idea of adding in carbohydrates. We're seeing it. And that's a good segue into the next clip, which is from Ken Berry and Dr. Chaffee. And this was, like, I think Ken Berry even acknowledged that this was like a state of the carnivore, like, we're addressing the carnivore community, because there's so many defectors right now. So we need to bring our two best minds together and hash things out. And so that's kind of what this discussion was. But we have some clips from their podcast, and we'll jump into that.
Like when Charlie, like, did the State of the Union address for the Peat forum on the low vitamin A diet.
Yeah. It was like, okay, like, the plebs are rebelling, and we must we must come together and shame them publicly. This can't go on the podcast, right?
I mean, it can. Is kind of like, you had influencers who came out and they're like, look, like, I had problems on carnivore, and doing these things fixed it. Paul Saladino, Lily Kane, Tristan Lee. Like, we talked about this in my Max German response video. They came out like, these are the problems I ran into, and this is why I added carbs back in, and here's what happened. I think that's more helpful for people, so that they can see, like, am I experiencing these problems? Like, what could be the cause of these problems? Because after you add in salt, and you add more fat and you take the fat out and then you add in more protein, and because you only have so many options,
Right.
right? There's only so many options with the carnivore, like with the carnivore or keto diets for adjustment before you start being like, before you like run out of things to do. So I think people get burnt in the spears because like, I don't know, I can't add more fat, guys. Like I am so full, I can't eat enough calories, I can't keep my weight on. I'm still dehydrated no matter how much LMNT I take. Like this is the stuff that I think people are falling into. And they're like, okay, like what's the other solution? And then you go to carbs. I just think the problem is when you go to carbs, depending on which paradigm you come into, it's like you go sugar diet, and it's like, yeah, ad libitum sugar as long as you have no fat and just keep your protein low. It's like, that's also not a reasonable diet. It's also not a reasonable setup, especially transitioning out of a carnivore diet or a keto diet. So these are, I'm not trashing the sugar diet, but it's like you just have these extreme camps that people fluctuate through.
Yeah.
And it's like, we need to get to some sense of like a reasonable dietary setup so people can actually reach and achieve their health goals and like sustain it over the long term. Even in the research, it's known that most people don't sustain keto diets. They won't maintain them.
Right. I think there's a net benefit from the sugar diet trend in people doing it, but it did just feed like Ken Berry and these guys like perfect talking points, right? To like, look how crazy, look at these guys, like they're so dumb, just eating all the sugar, eating Sour Patch Kids, eating this and that, and it's like, okay, yeah, you're willing to make videos and talk about that, but what about these like other legitimate, diets, right, of whole foods, fruits, carbohydrates, improvements in hormonal function, improvements in energy, all the kind of stuff. Like, let's talk about that. Okay, the sugar diet thing is, it has its place, right, and people are trying it, but yeah, they just jumped on that. Like, Ken Berry made this like super sarcastic 7-minute video where he's just going like, yeah, this is a great diet, you should definitely do this, it's gonna be so good for you, whatever. And then at the end, it's just so patronizing. But anyway,
Yeah. We'll jump.
Okay, yeah, we'll jump into the clip.
Yeah. I guess the only thing I'd say is the benefit of the sugar diet was just showing people that if you plowed a bunch of sugar, like it doesn't automatically make you fat diabetic or give you a fatty liver. But like, again, it just doesn't have to be this like pendulum where it's like no carbs to all only carbs. Like you can have a reasonable dietary setup. I feel like that's the point we've been fighting all along. Is like, look, like you can have some protein and some carbs and some fats. You don't have to like, only have carbs or only have fats or only have plant foods or only have animal foods, like this type of, and we'll touch on this with their clips. It's because there's interesting comments in here for Dr. Anthony Chaffee, but it's like there is individualization with the diet and not recognizing that in terms of how you respond to different things as an individual and kind of trying to figure out what's working best for your circumstance, and your lab values and your symptoms line up together and are moving in the right direction. Like if you deny that and you ignore that, you're going to have a hard time finding your way. And I think that's the problem with some of these communities is like, there's just like denial. It's like, okay, I changed my diet. You go from low carb, you go to a higher carb, you change your diet and some marker gets worse and some gets better. The question is not, well, let's redefine these markers. It's like, well, why did this get worse? What's going on? What can we fix with this dietary setup to try to make sure things move in the right direction? Is this a transitional thing or is this something that we have to directly address? And I think actually taking an open-minded look at stuff and being like, okay, well, maybe there's something I'm doing that's not dialed in 100%. How can I fix that? I think that's the most important way to go, and just like, okay, we have to adjust instead of being like, oh, low carb is the diet that we're supposed to run with. And if it doesn't work, it's because you're either carb addicted, you're a baby, or whatever the thing is that we get from this fear.
Yeah. So. Agreed. Amen. Okay. Let's jump into the next clip.
Well, I don't know if I couldn't say that they've discovered a new thing, because basically the advice they're giving is the exact same dietary advice that we've been given for the last 50 years, which is get about 65% calories from carbs and have a bit of lean meat and some veggies and things like that. Keep your fat under 15, 20%. I mean, I took a nutrition class in 1998, and that was exactly what I was told. So this is the same advice that we've been given for a long time, and that's exactly what has failed so many hundreds of millions of people up to now. That is the diet that I was raised on. That is the diet that gave my mom diabetes after 45 years. So I don't see that as a new concept. I don't think they've reinvented the wheel somehow. So it's going to be multifactorial. There's going to be a lot of different people that have different motivations.
So this first portion of the clip is basically Anthony Chaffee and or Dr. Anthony Chaffee and Dr. Ken Berry talking about why people are defecting from the carnivore sphere, right? This is what you were talking about before opening up the State of the Union address for carnivores.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, like, Anthony Chaffee here opens with a straw man. It's like he's saying that people are saying to go back to like this 65% carb diet that's less than 15 or 10% fat. It's like no one is advocating for that. At least that I know of. Like, I don't think, from what I've seen, Paul Saladino recommending that, nor have I seen people in the bioenergetic sphere necessarily recommending that, or even like Lily Kane or Tristan Lee or stuff like this. I mean, I'm not an expert on their content, to be fair, but I'm not seeing like, oh, you need to be less than 15 or 10% fat and you need to go on a 65% carbohydrate diet. When I was going through their stuff for the Max Sherman video, it was like they were just adding some carbs into their diet, and they were still like on a largely animal-based diet to some extent, in the sense that they had quite a bit of protein. So quite a bit of animal protein and fat still. So I think that no one is calling to go back to standard dietary recommendations that we saw from the food pyramid. Nobody's saying go on a whole grain diet with high amounts of seed oils in the diet and then allow for a portion of like processed foods in the diet. That wasn't what people were calling for. So it's kind of a straw man argument to then, oh, that was a diet that gave my mom diabetes, was the standard diet recommendations. And that's what these people are recommending. It's like, first you're straw manning the argument, and now you're conflating your mom's diabetes with their dietary recommendations. Like, that's logically inconsistent and a little bit disingenuous. So what I would say is that the recommendation for people, like the things that we're seeing, is just, if you're having some problems, right, with your thyroid function, with your electrolyte balance, with your sleep, with your blood glucose creeping up in the morning, with your hemoglobin A1C values creeping up in the morning. And this is something that they talk about with Dr. Siwas, which again, like, I'm not a super fan of Dr. Siwas' work, but he's saying like, hey, you start adding in a bit of carbohydrate and some of these problems will resolve. And it's like, that's what we see as well. You add in carbohydrate for these people, not less, they have to have their fat now less than 10%. You add in carbohydrate, you still have, high quality, nutrient dense mixture of animal foods and then some fruits and some vegetables and stuff like this. And you start to see, okay, like these things improve for these people. So it's kind of it's like this weird dynamic, this weird straw man arguments that's getting erected here. And this is not what's being advocated for on the other side. It's not going back to standard dietary recommendations. And the other thing is, like, you have this, again, it's like carb versus fat. And it's like the food selection is also really important. If you have somebody who comes in, it's like, yeah, my diet, I eat, grass-fed meat and pasture-raised eggs and wild-caught seafood and pasture-raised chicken and stuff like this, and like maybe high-quality dairy. And then I also have some fruits in there, some whole fruits, some stuff like this, and then maybe some tubers. It's like, would you then conflate that with a standard American diet? Would you say that the outcomes would be the same? And I haven't seen that. I don't think that would be the case. So it's like, it's almost like you're either carnivore, and if you don't do it exactly how I say it, which is like meat and water, then like you're just not. And it's like, okay, fine. That's fine, but then it's like grouping everything else in this other camp. And that's not what's being advocated for. These are not all the other same things. If you're not carnivore, then it's not everything else. Like, there's differences with everything else outside of the carnivore sphere. It's like a little bit of a myopic perspective and a straw man argument that I think was getting erected here from Anthony Chaffee around the people who are leaving the carnivore sphere. And again, like, even Paul's recommendations for fat composition and carb composition in a diet vary from mine. And even Jay's vary a little bit from mine as well. Like, we all have a little bit of a different breakdown, but I haven't really seen any people in the bioenergetic camp or other people that he may be referencing, because he doesn't say names specifically here, say like, oh, go less than 10, 15% fat and go 65% carbs. There are some groups that say that, but not the people that I've seen who are leaving the carnivore sphere.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't really have anything to add. I mean, like, you're touched on the individuality of the diet, and I think that from Chaffee's perspective, that there really doesn't need to be individuality for the diet. I think he's cracked the code. Okay, let's jump back into the clip with Dr. Ken Berry and Dr. Anthony Chaffee talking about cortisol and thyroid function on the keto diet.
Some of them, I think this is directly related to their own bottom line and profiting from that. I think some people are genuinely concerned when they see these sorts of allegations that a ketogenic diet will elevate your cortisol, give you hypercortisolemia, it can give you a sort of Cushingoid reaction, or that it will drop your thyroid. Some people, in fact, who have been carnivore for over a decade have had some issues, and then but said specifically, my cortisol is fine, my thyroid is fine, I don't know what's going on, but something's happening. And others using their story by saying, see, this is proof that long-term carnivore causes thyroid and cortisol issues, even though they've said explicitly it has not. That's what the long-term data shows. That's what the randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses of the long-term randomized controlled trials on ketogenic diet shows that you don't get hypercortisolemia. You get a transient bump, still within normal range. It's not hypercortisolism in the first few weeks, and then this normalizes and rationalizes.
So, I mean, we see here Dr. Chaffee and Dr. Barrett. It's mainly Dr. Chaffee talking about that, like the concerns around cortisol levels and also thyroid function raising on a keto diet aren't there. Besides the initial 3-week increase in cortisol, and then so we already talked about thyroid. So like there is an actual detriment in thyroid function that he talked about, and this is known in the research, and this is not necessarily around TSH and T4 values, but around T3 values and reverse T3 values. But also, it is true that within the first 3 weeks of a low carb keto diet, you have a shift in where you have a rise in cortisol signaling. This is true, and this, I think, goes in hand in part with the keto flu as you're switching your fuel sources over. But the other thing, and I've talked about this in a separate video, is that they did a study. This was a little bit longer than that typical 3-week time frame. They went up into 4 weeks. They looked at men, and what they found was that the cortisol signaling changed. So even if the serum values aren't shifted, at the tissue levels, you have a change in cortisol signaling so that you are regenerating cortisol and you're decreasing its breakdown. So less cortisol is being broken down by 5-alpha and 5-beta reductase enzymes, and then more cortisol is being regenerated through 11-beta HSD1 enzyme. So you're taking cortisol and converting it to cortisol at a higher rate, and you're decreasing that breakdown of the cortisol and excretion into the urine. So these are like, the question is does this actually occur over the longer term? And from my experience with some clients' Dutch tests, which give you a better view of some of the metabolites, you actually do see this for people, their cortisol signaling over time is still upregulated on a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. And then carnivore diets are even worse, I would say, than the ketogenic diets, because you have this very high protein intake, and it's known that the very high protein intake, which you see on carnivore diets, like even when I went through Max Sherman's video, I went through Paul's initial carnivore setup, his protein intake is massive. This leads to an increased production of ammonia by clearing the amino acids, taking the amino group off, which needs an upregulation of the urea cycle. So if you're on a very high protein diet with very low carbs and high fat, you can actually increase some of the cortisol signaling via needing to upregulate the urea cycle to clear all the amino acids, and that can also lower testosterone levels. So I think from a keto diet and a carnivore diet, even if serum values aren't upregulated over time of cortisol, I think you likely have a change in metabolism of cortisol at the tissue level with an increased activation through 11-beta HCC1 and a decreased degradation. And this is the thing, is like, even if it's not out of range, chronically driving cortisol, even in the top end of the range, is not ideal from a health standpoint because of glucocorticoids' known effects on the body, on your tissues, on your central nervous system, on your immune function, etc., on your metabolic function. So the goal is not to be like, oh, well, it's still in range, so it's fine. It's like, yeah, like even being in the top end of range for certain markers really isn't ideal. And this is not me like trying to change the ranges based on what I see. It's like from the research we look at certain ranges or for certain values, and we can see that these are not good areas to be in, right? Like if TSH is greater than 2, that's not associated with good outcomes. Greater than 4, you're in the hypothyroid territory. The range used to go up to 8. So the current research is starting to look at some of these ranges and be like, okay, like we actually have data to support this, not hypothesis that it's like, oh, well, when you're low carb, your thyroid just like it works better, so therefore you don't need as much hormone. It's like, no, when we look at some of these other outcomes, with certain values, ferritin, TSH, etc., high cortisol levels, these things are not good. And with the known effects of cortisol, I wouldn't be trying to optimize for that type of signaling. the one other thing I want to add is that they talk about cortisol, but there's also an increase in glucagon. So as you decrease carbohydrate intake and you increase your fat intake, you get into a circumstance where you start to rely more heavily on glucagon. And you can see this. I have a paper here that looked at this. This is, I think, after 80 days or so of a low carbohydrate diet. You can see glucagon signaling here is higher at baseline. So this is, they're looking at it after meals, and then after the meal was elevated as well. This actually isn't ideal because glucagon is associated in the research with directly driving insulin resistance. And basically, when you look at human studies, if we look at human studies, what you can find is that the higher the glucagon levels and the decreased suppression after eating, kind of the worse outcomes or the more association you see with diabetic states. So here you have oral glucose tolerance testing, and then basically you see 3 states. So the light blue line are people who are normal glucose tolerance. The dark blue line are people who are impaired glucose tolerance, and then the red line are people who have diabetes. And you can see the glucagon levels across the 2 groups are significantly, like the diabetes is the highest, impaired glucose tolerance is the second highest, and then the normal glucose tolerance is the lowest. And then the glucagon suppression is actually shifted amongst these different groups as well. So higher glucagon signaling in general is found in people with impaired glucose tolerance. And these diets are selecting for increased glucagon signaling. So I would say that I would consider glucagon as well as cortisol stress hormones in this circumstance. And I wouldn't want to be selecting for dietary intakes that are pushing for higher glucagon levels or adjustments in cortisol signaling to have higher levels across the board from an optimal health perspective.
Well, and then that kind of brings back into the conversation insulin, right? So we talked about how insulin is good for hydrating the cells, but it also does a good job of shutting off glucagon production as well too. And the way you stimulate insulin is by eating carbohydrate, correct?
Exactly. And the eating carbohydrate also lowers glucagon signaling as well. And you can see elevated glucagon levels in diseases like diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and chronic kidney disease. And you basically also see a state of glucagon resistance where glucagon doesn't shut off when it's supposed to when you have the insulin signaling. So they're even talking about now that in diabetes, it's not just a state of elevated insulin signaling. It's actually a state of elevated glucagon as well. And some of the strategies that they put in place are around basically lowering glucagon using glucagon antagonistic drugs. So again, like these are part of it's part of the pathology, glucagon directly in the diabetic state. So it's not really an ideal thing to select for. And the low carbohydrate diets, as a rule, select for the glucagon signaling because you don't have adequate carbohydrates. So you have to rely on glucagon to break down amino acids so that you can convert those amino acids into glucose through gluconeogenesis, right? So you have this going on, and the carnivore diet's even worse for that because the carnivore diet's very high in protein intake. You are driving gluconeogenesis on the carnivore diet, which is also why I think that you tend to see the fasting glucose values pick up and the hemoglobin A1C values get worse on carnivore versus keto diets. At least anecdotally, that's what I've seen. And I think it's because you have this very high protein intake. So you're really forcing that gluconeogenesis compared to the keto diet where protein intake has to actually be managed to a certain level because you don't want to drive gluconeogenesis because you're trying to push for fatty acid oxidation and push for ketone production, which the ketones as a fuel source are better than fats in general. They oxidize more closer or more similarly to glucose than they actually do to fatty acids. So it's like, I was selecting for this source, like, oh, well, ketones run like this. Like, yeah, they run closer to glucose.
Yeah. And you're going to have a hard time getting into ketosis with the super high protein intake is what you're saying.
Yes, because you're going to convert it to glucose.
Right. Okay. Right. So let's jump into this next clip here. And this is going to be Dr. Chaffee talking about if the carnivore diet isn't working for you, or I guess his overall take on the individuality of everyone's diet.
Yeah. So
this is like you say, this is the proper human diet. This is what we're biologically designed to eat. And so I work on that idea that this should work. I mean, you're not going to find a line, well, everyone's individual snowflakes and everything like that. Like, well, okay, so we're lions, but every single lion still needs meat, and they still do best on meat. And so if a lion is having a problem, I'm going to see, okay, well, meat shouldn't be the problem. So let's figure out what else is going on. And when I approach it the same way with people, we always find what's going on.
All right. So this is just such an interesting take, that it's like the carnivore diet is the diet that humans are supposed to have, and therefore meat and the lack of carbohydrates could never be the issue, right? It's like, this is the diet and we're going to work back from there, instead of like constantly, like, this is an anti-scientific stance. It's like, I already have the answer. This could never be the problem, or this can't be the problem because this is the diet we're supposed to have. So it has to always be something else. Whereas a scientific perspective is like, is my theory, my hypothesis, and what I'm running with, is this correct in these different contexts and circumstances? Does it stand the test of reality in these different circumstances? This is more like, this other thing is more like, no, this is already right. I know this. And then like, it has to then be something else. So I don't think that's a very intellectually sound perspective to hold when trying to understand these things, especially because we aren't lions. Like, demonstrably, from all metrics, we aren't lions. Our digestive tracts are different than lions, right? We have a bit of a different setup in terms of running gluconeogenesis. Our physiology is a little bit different than lions and wolves and stuff like this. So to like start from that perspective, it's like, first you need to prove that that's correct, which I haven't seen that proven, that we are lions, or that our digestive tract, our metabolic needs, our nutrient needs are the same as lions. So to start from this perspective and then assume that this is always correct and therefore the problem is something always else, I think fundamentally it's like your first tenet is flawed. Your first perspective is flawed. You haven't proven this, and then you're running with that, and then everything else from there is the problem, except for this. It's a very weird dynamic to look at.
As someone who was low carb and even carnivore for a period of time, I think the community does get frustrated with like prominent low carb figures kind of feeling like they are working backwards, from the solution. Like, they don't have so many tricks up their sleeve. Like, there's only so many things that you can change, And so like they talk about earlier in the podcast, dairy, like if you're doing dairy, maybe you're having a problem with that. So if you're having any sort of problem, like remove that. Maybe coffee, and maybe modulating like the fat to protein ratio. But there's really, and eggs, like maybe you're intolerant to eggs or egg whites, something like this. So there's really a limited amount of things that you can change if you're not feeling well in that perspective. And so they kind of do have to fall back on like, well, there has to be this external source that's giving you stress, or really you're kind of out of luck, or maybe you're not following it like 100%. And it's like a little bit gaslighting, and it feels like that was a little bit of like saying the quiet part out loud. Like, I know this works, so let me work backwards from there. And then the clip kind of cuts off short, because Ken Berry follows it up by saying like, yeah, I think that's a great paradigm to work from. It's like, it's actually not. It's actually like you said, it's not a good paradigm to work from. It's the exact opposite.
Yeah, I think you should always be questioning your paradigm.
Yeah.
You should always be questioning, like, with the different circumstances, like, okay, am I getting feedback from real life with what I'm doing?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the theory, and then you have the practice, and you need to see them moving together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The practice needs to support the theory. And then if there's something like, if something that you're experiencing, like the experiment that you're running, isn't working out, then it's like, okay, is the experiment set up appropriately, or is my initial hypothesis is that disproven?
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like, okay, back to the drawing board and figure out, okay, what else could be going on, trying to understand it from there. And everything is on the table. Every piece is on the table to understand what's going on, and try, none of us are omniscient, right?
Mm-hmm.
No one's omniscient. And it's a process of trying to figure out what's going on in each person's circumstance.
Yeah.
And how are you going to get them to achieve these health outcomes? And I think you even see that now with I think Judy Cho now is like into all the sear stuff. And it's not a surprise, right? Because it's like, if you're on a carnivore diet and you're doing water and salt and meat, and then it's not working, it's like, well, it has to be this like chronic inflammatory response from something else. It could, because the reason I say is I've had quite a few clients come back and it's like they did low carb, they did this, and it's like, oh, I have sears, oh, I have mold poisoning, oh, I have Lyme, oh, I have this, oh, I have that, and it's like, okay, that's possible, don't doubt it, but let's like just make some adjustments here while you work with your sears, your Lyme practitioner, whatever you're doing. And it's like, oh, you know what? Like I added in some carbs, I shifted up my diet, I feel a lot better. I'm not chronically fatigued anymore. I'm not having all the same digestive issues and stuff like this.
Yeah. It just it brings me back to the carnivore days, and like one of the most compelling things about bioenergetics is that the idea is that your state is always changing, therefore your individual diet or the way you're interacting with your environment, which is your diet as well, can always change too, in a good way and a bad way. And like, there's so many more tools you have in this approach to help improve that state, to help improve your environment, that you can like ascend essentially. Whereas this perspective is more just like, we have such limited tools and we're so dogmatic that this is like the diet that you need to be on. This is the proper human diet, as I think Ken Berry calls it. And it's just like, hey, your proper diet could fluctuate, as things change in your life, like as different stressors come on board and everything. And so it's kind of like claustrophobic, or it's kind of limiting, to feel like you've tried everything, you've exhausted everything, and it's still not working for you. And God forbid you step out on a limb and try carbohydrates and see improvements and then talk about it online. Don't do that unless you want to really like make people mad and stuff. So yeah, I don't know. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I think I just want to be careful because there's like a relativism to stuff. And I don't think that I believe that there's objective truths, but I think that they're like, some things are contextual, or everything is contextual. So there are contexts where things adjust. And that's why I think it's important to always test your hypothesis. But I think the fundamental flaw in this perspective for me is that it's like, no, this is right. And I'm like, it can't be this. It has to be something else. And I think that is that's where I would take exception to the idea. And then the idea that it's like, no, we're all lions and there's like no individuality because lions just eat meat. It's like, that is a really myopic and I think not supported perspective in this setup. Like, it's like the foundational pillars here are just like, they're not supported. Like, there hasn't been this, okay, like we know this thing for a fact, or we have this very strong set of evidence that supports this idea. It's like, this is just his belief. That's not really supported. Even statements that he's made that I've talked about in other areas, like all animals are in ketosis or whatever the thing was, is something like this, like a large portion of animals are in ketosis. Like, this is not true. This is not supported. These statements are being made, but they're not supported. So you could come out with a statement. That's why I put the papers here. And it's like, okay, here's some support for what I'm saying. So you can follow up on what I'm looking at. And you can say, okay, like, where's Mike coming from? Where are we coming from with our perspective? What is the thought process here? So you can follow the trail. This is just like, yeah, we're lions. And it's like, I know it's kind of a framework, but it's, it's like, we're not. There's this difference. And again, like, support your initial tenet. So I think these things are, I think this is like this is a big problem in the sphere. And you see this, as you talked about, like when you go on a forum and it's not working for you, right? The diet's not working for you. You're just sitting there, you're like, I tried adding more fat, I tried adding more meat, I tried adding more salt, and I tried like playing with this stuff, and then that's just not working. It's like, well, okay, there's something else going on that needs to be addressed. And is it the paradigm that you're running? And even when I'm working with clients, if I run into a snag with something, which I do, like as a practitioner, you always run into snags. The job as a practitioner is to be able to troubleshoot, help people adjust the diet and figure out what's going on. It's like when you're running, okay, the hypothesis is this. And it's like, okay, well, this is not lining up with this hypothesis. So what? Then you start to think about, like, is there something that we're doing that's off? And that's my first thought process usually. Is there something that we already established that isn't working how we think it's working or how we want it to? And then after that, it's like, is there something else that we need to be doing to move the needle. And so you should have the mental flexibility or cognitive flexibility to always be questioning what you're doing. It's like cognitively it's a bit painful, but it also is necessary if you want to get outcomes, because the goal is to get people better fundamentally, not make sure that your hypothesis, your perspective is always correct. You only want to be correct insofar that it helps people reach their goal. Your theory is correct and it works. It's not, I want to be correct for the sake of being correct. I think this is kind of like a fundamental difference. But I also think your health state dictates this, right? When you're in it, when you have more energy availability, when things are working better metabolically, you have more cognitive flexibility and you're okay. You come from a different perspective. You don't have this rigidity where you have to have everything that you believe, like that's it, that's the rule, that's the line, there's nothing else. Like you're open to and it's not a moral relativism. It's more just like, can my understanding, as you were talking about, Ethan, unfold and grow and develop, and I learn new things and I adjust and start to piece things together as I test my hypotheses and understandings in new contexts and perspectives. And this is like, no, I'm already right. And then that's just, there has to be something else there. It's a complete opposite dynamic, I would say, intellectually.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, with that said, let's jump into the next clip where Dr. Ken Berry and Dr. Chi.
And so I haven't seen that.
Something that worries me about our mutual friend, Dr. Paul Saladino, he's still very animal-based, meat-based, but he eats lots of fruit and quite a bit of honey. And some days he eats 300-400 grams of carbohydrates from fruit and honey. And one of the things that worries me about that is the degree of fructation or fructose glycation, because what I can't get him to admit, even though I've showed him the studies, is that the hemoglobin A1C test only checks for glucose glycation. That's all it checks for. Even the fructosamine that has fruct in the name only checks for glucose glycation. And we know from research that fructose is 7 to 10 times more glycating than glucose. And so I really worry about the long-term effects of this fructose glycation, but he doesn't seem worried at all. Are you comfortable if one of your clients or a family member says, hey, I want to do this, the Paul Saladino version where I'm eating lots of meat, but also drinking lots of fruit juice and eating lots of fruits? What would you say to them to either say, yeah, that's fine, or yeah, I would rather you not, and here's why?
I generally would rather they not. And certainly if people want to experiment in these sorts of things, but that's up to them. It's their life. But I've had a lot of people that have done that, and they've sort of gone down a slippery slope and start adding a bit more and a bit more and a bit more. Then all of a sudden they're adding in more carbs and more things. And then 6 months later, they're on the couch eating Doritos and pizza, and they've regained all this weight and things like that. And they just go, okay, I got to get back. And I also talk about the glycation effect and the fructation, because whether or not you're developing insulin resistance or diabetes, you're getting these spikes. And even if that comes back down to a normal level, I mean, even just talking about glucose, even if your blood sugar comes back to a normal level, you still have this spike. You still have that area under the curve that you're going to be damaging your body. And that's something that I take seriously, because that glycation is such a major driver of disease. I mean, it just damages the inside of your vessels. It's destroying those small vessels that go to your kidney, that go to your eye, that go to your feet. And number one cause of kidney failure is high blood sugar, diabetes. Number one cause of adult onset blindness is high blood sugar, diabetes. The number one risk of getting your legs amputated is high blood sugar and diabetes. So I worry about that. And this happens over time. This happens over a long time, but you are going to get this damage even if you're not seeing it right now. Fructose, like you said, 7-8 times the glycative effect of glucose.
There's a lot to get into on that one.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conflation there. So the first thing I want to point out, and this is something that Dr. Ken Berry posited, is that he said fructose is 7 times more glycating than glucose, 7 or 8 times more glycating than glucose. I forget which one he said. The thing is, that's true. Agreed with him. That is true in the cell culture studies. You do see fructose be much more glycating than glucose. But the question is, what's the concentration of fructose that you would actually find in your bloodstream? And we've covered this ad nauseum. So there's a paper here. Paper titled Increased Fructose Concentration in Blood and Urine in Patients with Diabetes. This is a 2002 paper. And basically, what they say is serum fructose concentrations in patients with diabetes is 12 micromoles per liter. And these were significantly higher than those in healthy subjects, which were 8 micromole per liter, and in non-diabetics, which was 7.7 micromole per liter. So basically, what does that look like in milligrams per deciliter? So when we convert it over in the diabetics, that's 0.216 milligrams per deciliter of fructose. Just for comparison's sake, if we wanted to choose like an optimal fasting blood glucose, right, 80 milligrams per deciliter. So if we take the 80 milligrams per deciliter, right, 80, and we divide it by 0.216, there's 370 times less glucose in the blood than fructose. Now, you can consume fructose and you may get a bump.
Less fructose in the blood than glucose.
Less fructose in the blood than glucose. You have 370 times less fructose in the blood than glucose. So even if fructose is more glycating, you don't wind up in a circumstance where you're ever seeing appreciable amounts of fructose to the point that it's more than 7 times the glucose is still always going to be more than 7 times the concentration of fructose in the blood. So it doesn't really work out that way to just say, oh, fructose is more glycating, therefore you should avoid it. I think that's it's incorrect. It's not physiologically correct to make that extension, even though it is physiologically true that fructose is more glycating than glucose. It also doesn't speak to the point, and this is something that's really important, that the most glycating agent, one of the most glycating agents that we have is methylglyoxal. And methylglyoxal is produced in part through intermediates in glycolysis, which is through glucose metabolism, but also through ketones. So ketones can be converted into methylglyoxal. And methylglyoxal is up to, and this is from a paper, this is ketosis leads to increased methylglyoxal production on the Atkins diet, which is typically a ketogenic diet. And the participants in this study had their ketone levels tested to see if they were on a keto diet. They're testing beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate. What they say here is methylglyoxal is up to 40,000 times more chemically reactive than glucose and has multiple cytotoxic effects. These include inhibition of cell growth, apoptosis, mutagenic effects, inhibition of enzymatic activity, production of protein cross-linking and fragmentation, and serving as an important precursor for advanced glycation end products. So methylglyoxal creates the advanced glycation end products, which that's the concern with carbohydrates. What they further say, they say on a low carbohydrate diet, such as the Atkins diet, patients become ketotic with elevated levels of acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate. Acetoacetate breaks down into acetone, which studies have shown oxidizes into acetol, a precursor of methylglyoxal, possible precursor of methylglyoxal. And so in this paper, what they're saying is that you can increase your methylglyoxal production from being on a keto diet, and the methylglyoxal is way more glycating than fructose and glucose, like significantly more so. So yeah, you could talk about fructose and glucose, that's fine. But the other thing we really want to know is, what about methylglyoxal? Because even a much smaller concentration of this is going to be more glycating because it's much more reactive than both fructose and glucose. So that's point number one. I don't know if you want to say anything.
No, I mean, no one talks about that. So this was the first time that I ever heard anything like this. Yeah, so no, go ahead.
Yeah, and then the other thing, so another important piece to talk about is that, so fructose, and Anthony Chaffee kind of talks about this here with diabetes, like, oh, the glucose just destroys your bloodstream and it's just going to drive glycation. And, diabetes, like high blood glucose in the states of diabetes, like the number one cause of kidney disease. And yeah, in diabetes, you tend to see more glycation, right? But the diabetics aren't just having problems with glucose oxidation, they're having problems with fatty acid oxidation. And the fructation or the glycation from fructose that you see in diabetics inside the cells is not because they are necessarily consuming fructose in their diet. It's because they have problems with taking the glucose and converting it into energy in the cell. And then the glucose gets backlogged through glycolysis and through the polyol pathway. And via the polyol pathway, fructose is actually created from glucose in the cell. So the problem is the metabolic dysfunction, that where you have a backflow or a kind of a backup of glucose at the cell with a shunting towards the polyol pathway, and then you have problems in glycolysis, right? So you get in diabetics, what you tend to see is glycolysis gets upregulated and shunted towards lactate production, not necessarily for glucose to move into the mitochondria because you have issues in the mitochondria. And then that backflow is the issue where you start to see that's where you can have glycolytic intermediates like dihydroxyacetone phosphate get converted into methylglyoxal, or you can see some of the glucose get converted through the polyol pathway to fructose, and that's where you get glycation. But it's not because they're consuming fructose and the fructose just makes its way into the bloodstream and makes its way into the cells and drives this problem. So it's like, again, like not a full or a complete understanding, at least from my perspective, of the physiology. It's like, oh, diabetics have high blood glucose levels and they tend to get worse kidney disease, and they tend to have higher glycation, so therefore it must be carbs it's because they have high blood glucose. And it's like diabetics have metabolic dysfunction specific at the mitochondrial level. They do not use fuel sources well across the board. And even when you look at diabetic ketoacidosis, it's like they are failing to respond to glucose to such a point that they have high free fatty acid release and in ketone production because they're basically at metabolic failure at that point. And so it's the lack of focus of like what is driving the metabolic failure. Why are they experiencing metabolic failure? It's like, oh, it's just the carbs. And it's like kind of this conflationary perspective. And so I think those are my responses to this glycation piece. Like, it just doesn't line up. The fructose argument and then even the glucose argument, it's like whether you're having carbs or you're having fats, you can still get methylglyoxal production because both of them can produce methylglyoxal. And that's really what's going to drive age formation more so than your glucose inside the cell, as Ken Berry talks about, or your fructose. And that's specifically glucose and fructose from consumption, right?
And methylglyoxal production would be much more likely, right, in the ketogenic state or high fat state versus when you're carb fed, right?
So, and on a ketogenic diet, they have a graphic here from this paper. So let me show you here. So the methylglyoxal levels, this is in micromoles. On day 0, they were about 50. By day 20 on the Atkins diet, and these are for people who had been they tested their ketone levels and found that they were in ketosis, it went up 7 times.
Jeez.
Now, for normal people who oxidize glucose effectively and are able to take the glucose and run it through glycolysis and convert it into energy inside the mitochondria, you probably aren't going to have a backlog of dihydroxyacetone phosphate to drive this problem, and you shouldn't have a massive overflow into the polyol pathway. The glucose should come in and move well, and that's why what you want to see from a metabolically healthy standpoint is you can have carbs, and then your fasting glucose is good, and your insulin is good, and your A1C values are good. It means you can eat the carbs and convert them into energy in the cell pretty well. There's not significant problems with that system. That's the ideal metabolic state, at least from the pro-metabolic perspective. Again, for some of the reasons I talked about in the beginning, the hormonal effects, the risk of glycating effects, all of this type of stuff, the hydrating and electrolyte balance. So that's what we're trying to shoot for as the ideal target state. That's what we're looking to reach. And in that state, you shouldn't really have high amount of methylglyoxal production because, again, it shouldn't overflow in those pathways. Now, if you have a diabetic who is you have this weird state with diabetics, right? Because you have a high fasting glucose level, but then you have high glucagon levels. And then you have this free fatty acids being released, but then the glucose is being shunted through lactate. So it's you're comparing, if you take a normal person, right? They don't have diabetes. And then what happens with them with carbs and fats and fuels in general is different than somebody who's a diabetic. The state is different. The hormonal regulation is different. What's going on in the mitochondria is different because this is dysfunction and this is not dysfunction.
Right. And the prescription, like we've talked about earlier in the podcast, is not to just cut out the carbohydrates at that point. No,
because that's just you will see some markers get better.
Mm-hmm.
You'll see A1C and hemoglobin, A1C and insulin values and stuff like this drop. Mm-hmm. And you may need to adjust your carbohydrate intake in that state. But you're basically you're not necessarily fixing things in that way.
Yep.
You're just you're removing
the chunk.
You're not allowing yourself to see the dysfunction anymore because now you're not going to have these markers elevated because you don't have the glucose coming in.
Right.
The ideal state where you like actually somebody is cured of diabetes is that they're able to now take in carbohydrate and have like oxidize it into ATP from the Krebs cycle to the electron transport chain, have normal insulin, normal A1C, all this type of stuff. So that's a cured state. Just removing carbohydrate and seeing A1C and insulin drop is like you don't have carbohydrate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is where the things get difficult, because when you typically go low carb, you change all these factors as I talked about in the beginning, and you lose weight, you lose body fat, you clear out liver fat, and then you increase your protein intake and you lower polyunsaturated fat consumption from heated seed oils and stuff like this, and you improve your micronutrient status. All of this type of stuff is going to improve your insulin sensitivity and your ability to take substrate and convert it into fuel. And if you go into a caloric deficit, which these diets tend to produce, intermittent fasting, 1 meal a day, carnivore 1 meal a day diets, all this type of stuff, you go into caloric deficits, you are also removing pressure off the system because the engine's not being flooded with fuel anymore, right? You are pulling back some of the fuel so that it's not consistently getting flooded deep into the engine, which is not processing it effectively. So that's why in these states you see people lose weight. Just the losing weight by itself can have a massive impact on their metabolic markers. And you can do that with carbs or without carbs. You can lose weight on a low carb diet. You can lose weight on a high carb diet.
Mm-hmm.
You can improve micronutrient status and shift your food quality on a high carb or a low carb diet. You can be in a medium carb, medium protein, medium fat diet. These things can all these things will all work if they're set up appropriately. So it's not like this dichotomy per se that we're seeing. You know, you either have to be really high fat or you really have to be really high carb, and that's it. Like those are the two options.
Right. Okay, so the last topic that we want to wrap up with is around CO2. So we have a clip from Dr. Ray Peat talking about how carbohydrates are the ideal fuel source for CO2 production.
Well, one of the themes I've been interested in for a long time is the function of carbon dioxide in cells. And in some observations, people have seen that the most improbable organism is unable to live without carbon dioxide, even though they can live without oxygen. And ordinarily we think of oxygen turning into carbon dioxide as a waste product, but it really seems to be even more essential for life than oxygen. And carbohydrates are a very good source of carbon dioxide. They oxidize and produce a lot of carbon dioxide. And if carbon dioxide is that essential to life, then obviously the best food to produce it is going to be carbohydrates. And in these recent newsletters, I've been pointing out some of the things that are becoming fairly common knowledge now, that failing heart, for example.
Well, I think I think CO2 deserves like its own episode. That's one of like the big pillars of the bioenergetic perspective. But your thoughts?
There is an episode coming soon on CO2. So, but basically, I think that this is central to, like, if you want to understand the importance of mitochondrial energy production, you need to understand CO2. And calling it just a waste product, I think, is a bit of like, it's kind of a diss to CO2 for what CO2 does. So when you look in mitochondrial energy production, you need oxygen, right? Oxygen is the final electron acceptor at the electron transport chain. If you don't have oxygen, right, you die. That's why people die when they're asphyxiated, because you can't get enough oxygen to the tissues. Mitochondrial energy production fails. And then when the cells can't produce energy, nothing happens. Like they can't maintain electrolyte balance. They can't maintain any of their functions. So lack of energy is death, right? That's basically how it goes. And then lack of oxygen is lack of energy production, because oxygen is the final electron acceptor. So you need to get oxygen to the cells and tissues. You absolutely need to do it. But the thing is what controls whether you're getting the oxygen to the cells and tissues is CO2. So you need to get adequate CO2 levels. You want a high concentration of CO2 at the cells and tissues, because what happens is the red blood cells, when they sense this high oxygen level, the hemoglobin in them has a conformational change in shape that unloads the oxygen. And then the cells and tissue, it picks up the CO2 instead. It unloads the oxygen. Now the cells and tissues have oxygen to produce ATP. So you want to have high CO2 production at the cells and tissues. And then when you breathe, what happens, the reason you inhale and you exhale is because when you breathe in, you're taking in oxygen, which creates a high oxygen concentration at your lungs. And the red blood cells, when they get the high oxygen concentration and the low CO2 concentration, they actually unload the CO2 and they take up the oxygen, and your exhale is getting rid of some of that CO2. Now, this process is the two processes that are involved with this, the Bohr and the Haldane effects. They describe what happens with hemoglobin at different concentrations of oxygen and CO2. And they basically are describing the process that I just outlined. Now, something that's not heavily talked about in the keto sphere, the low carb sphere, is that the number one source of CO2 production in the body from a metabolic standpoint in normal, like ideal physiologic circumstances, not like respiratory failure or kidney failure, is cell respiration via burning carbohydrates. So you have something called the respiratory quotient, which basically looks at the amount of CO2 that you expel versus the amount of oxygen that you consume. Now, when you have a respiratory quotient of 1, you are expelling as much CO2 as oxygen that you are inspiring. When you have a respiratory quotient, so that's carbohydrate oxidation. Carbohydrate oxidation has a respiratory quotient of 1. Fatty acid oxidation has a respiratory quotient of about 0.71, which basically means that you are expiring less CO2 for the amount of oxygen that you're consuming. So fats inherently, because of how they are oxidized, produce less CO2. So now you have a circumstance where you have less CO2 production at the cellular level, which may impact the dynamics in terms of oxygen unloading to the tissues. And then on top of this, because fatty acids cause the uncoupling of the electron transport chain, you have the uncoupling effect. You need more oxygen to produce the same amount of ATP compared to carbohydrates. So fats have a worse ATP to oxygen ratio than carbohydrates because of uncoupling, right? So when the fats run through the Krebs cycle and they produce NADH and FADH2, when the electron transport chain allows some of the protons to escape through uncoupling proteins, you have a dynamic now where that doesn't go towards ATP production. So to get that ATP, you need to inspire more oxygen. You need to take in more oxygen for the process to work effectively. So it's like dual fold negative because you need more oxygen, but you produce less CO2 with fatty acids. Whereas with carbs, you need less oxygen, you're producing more CO2. So you can kind of see, based on these dynamics, there's a feed forward reaction with carbohydrates, where the carbohydrates are pushing the mitochondrial energy respiration forward, and carbs are the fats are kind of slowing things down. This is outside the specifics of this video. But essentially, what I talk about in the Randall cycle video, you also have a change in mitochondrial dynamics with fatty acid oxidation. This is a shift in NAD plus and NADH ratio, where you don't have enough NAD plus, which can impact the not the electron transport chain, which can impact the Krebs cycle to a large extent. And also, when you have a buildup of NADH, that can create ROS via reverse electron transport, the electron transport chain. So there's multiple ways where fats are actually not ideal as a fuel source from a mitochondrial standpoint, from a hormonal standpoint, from a mineral status and hydration standpoint. There's some problems with making fats the primary source of fuel. This is like a foundational tenet inside the bioenergetics. These are things that Dr. Peat had initially discussed, and then you can follow up on what he talked about, and you go on the research and you start to be like, man, this guy was on the game. And that's why we want to put the CO2 post here to give a nod to Dr. Peat, because Dr. Peat was the guy who he's not the person who found all these things. Like, those other researchers' work he built upon, but he put the picture together inside his articles and his interviews so that other people can start to see it as a broad picture instead of just these reductionistic angles.
Yeah. I mean, that was great about Dr. P, right? He was always kind of questioning what was seemingly settled. And CO2 being deemed like a waste product is something you hear, all the time. And turns out it's actually like, well, at least it's a good indicator as to how well your metabolism is functioning, right? How well you're oxidizing a fuel source. I mean, it is like cellular respiration, right? The exchange of gases and the CO2 being higher on the carb metabolism is a sign, right, that you're efficiently metabolizing the fuel. So
Yep.
Awesome. Well, that was a great breakdown on why it is better to be a carb burner, a sugar burner, than it is to be a fat burner. And there's probably a lot more. This podcast could go on for days, but maybe we'll make a part 2 or something in the future. I think it is a relevant conversation to be having now with people adding in carbohydrates and sort of getting turned on to this pro-metabolic and bioenergetic perspective. So for anybody who is watching who may be on a low-carb diet now, like I said in the beginning, I suggest checking out the pro-metabolic diet nutrition guide and calculator that Mike created. That'll be in the description. And also, too, if anyone is looking for coaching and they are kind of tired of consuming the nutrition content and piecemealing information from different podcasts and they just want to have a whole plan built out for them and follow it that way, then I think reaching out to you to do coaching would be awesome. And you'll have to have a conversation with me before that. So I'm happy to go through everything with you and then go from there. But is there anything you want to say before we sign off, Mike?
No, I just say that people should, or I would say my recommendation for people would be to test their individual hypothesis around what they're doing with the diet. And if you're running into problems, like, be open to reevaluating where those things are. And I wouldn't say that I'm always 100% right and I'm the number one authority or somebody else is, but it's more like to be open to the idea that, okay, like I'm doing this thing, I'm getting these outcomes. Some things are good, some things are bad. Is there a way that I can adjust things to reach the direction that I want? Or some of my foundational beliefs that I'm holding as the truth impacting or impairing me from moving in that direction? And I mean, those were things that I dealt with myself. Both you and I did low carb, intermittent fasting, stuff like this. And it was kind of like an aha moment when I started to add in carbs, and I like kind of rejected some of the perspectives that I was going through. And I also want to add to that is that if you adjust one perspective, right, where it's like, okay, maybe carbs aren't the enemy, it doesn't mean that all the perspectives are bad from the low carb sphere, stuff like this. There's a lot of value in some of the perspectives in the low carb sphere, the paleo spheres, even the plant-based spheres and stuff like this. Even the sugar diet, as you talked about, Ethan, there's some valuable lessons in these different dietary camps. Just not everything, not all the stuff in each dietary camp, I think, is correct. I think there's some nuggets of gold and there's some diamonds and then there's some coal. So you just got to discern and parse out the perspectives appropriately and kind of keep an open mind with this stuff and test in your own context what's going on. Because I don't think that we're all lions, and I do think there is a lot of individuality in the diet for people.
Fair enough. And where can people find you?
They can find me here on the podcast with you, the Mike Fave podcast. They can also find me on my website, mikefave.com.
Awesome. Okay. And I'm on Twitter at Ethan_right7. So with that said, we'll sign off and we'll see you guys in the next episode.